Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. As we do each and every Remembrance Day, we have a conversation with Dr. Tim Cook. He is the chief historian and the director of research at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. And honestly, if you haven't been, you should. I was there recently with some friends, and you actually forget how amazing that is. So, Tim, welcome and thank you for the work that you do. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Canada and the Korean War. This is the latest, or one of the latest books by Tim Cook. You might remember just a couple of weeks back, we had a conversation with Tim about his book called The Good Allies. And we're going to repost that pod so you can catch up on it. This is how Canada and the US really fought together, but how they forged their relationship when the US had been a bit reluctant to join World War II. And ironically, it was Canada who was there fighting full force that helped convince them to step up. They'd been supporting the effort, but to actually put boots on the ground. So that was an amazing story. But then we came across this, Canada and the Korean War. This is one of your more academic pieces, you say, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Great to be back with you. And yeah, as you were so kind to say there about the Canadian War Museum, we try to foster knowledge about Canadian military history. As you know, the men and women who have served this country in wars and conflicts of the past, all the way to today. And my colleague, Dr. Andrew Birch, and I, for a long time, had thought that, the Korean War is one of those fascinating wars and conflicts in the early part of the Cold War from 1950 to 1953.
Yeah.
That's not really well known to Canadians and our contributions there. And just very briefly, although I imagine we'll talk more about it, about 30,000 Canadians served in that war over a long period, rotating through a number of infantry units. We had a significant naval contribution. The RCAF flew critical logistical missions, and Canadian pilots flew with American fighters. And there was a diplomatic side to this. And it was really a dangerous period in the early Cold War. Of course, listeners will remember when North Korea communist invades South Korea, and this was a difficult time for the West, and we stood there in that alliance, and we paid a heavy price. About 516 Canadians killed.
516, and that's the sad irony of this, that it's the war that is not well remembered. I mean, there was the Great War, World War I. Nobody imagined there would be another war. Then there was. The necessary war, World War II, fighting fascism and communism, and then this kind of forgotten war. And it seems strange. In fact, I was just thinking last night, really, most people's connection with this war is watching MASH on television and a bunch of doctors trying to put mangled bodies back together again in a makeshift hospital. That's what we see. It's not fair.
Yeah, it's not fair. You're right. And with 30,000 Canadians having served, many of them, like their fathers or uncles, or some of them actually veterans of the Second World War, they were largely citizen soldiers. And by that, I mean they weren't professional soldiers. Some of them were, many of the officers. A large number were battle tested from the Second World War, of course, and that they felt that they, because they were trained up and skilled, that they would go back in and to fight this war very much against communism, or to stand by our alliance members, primarily the United States here leading this war effort, but also Britain and other Commonwealth nations. And of course, the South Koreans, who we can't call them a democratic nation at the time. It was a fledgling democracy.
Yeah,
And yet, and I hope we can talk more about this, Senator, later on, when talking to veterans, as I have been lucky to my whole life, many of them went back to South Korea decades later, and they were
yeah,
so surprised to see how this country had emerged almost from a rural nation to the powerhouse it is today. And they saw themselves as part of that process because, of course, we know the opposite. We know what North Korea is, that
yeah.
absolute hell on earth there.
That's and I know Korean vets. We had one in my Legion at home for sure, but I count them amongst my friend group too. And I think that's the important, one of the important legacies they claim, that you've got this thriving, successful democracy, a tech powerhouse, all of those things. And that's what we were able to do. Sometimes you don't always see the results of your effort and sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, how we remember war, how we commemorate it, how we talk about it is always different. And we're, of course, in Remembrance Week, soon to come up to Remembrance Day. We have veterans from many wars and conflicts. And I think you will have noticed, Senator, that rarely are those Korean War veterans featured very prominently
Yeah,
many of these Remembrance Day ceremonies. There's reasons for that. If we think of the two world wars, they are quite unique. 620,000 Canadians who served in the First World War from a country of 8 million.
right.
The
One
Second
in
World War,
10, eh? One in
yeah,
10.
that's right. And the Second World War, about the same, 1 in 10, 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, with our societies mobilized for the war
Yeah,
effort on the home front, wartime industry, the creation of weapons, food, minerals. Societies changed from things like income tax in the First World War, the right to vote, the nation building elements, the divisive nature of conscription, all of that. You can't understand Canadian history without that. The Korean War is quite different. It's more along the lines of the South African War in 1899 to 1902, or even the Afghanistan War. Long, sustained, big wars where we pay a cost, but they don't change society for the most
yeah.
part. And so,
No, it's true. And so you don't feel it at home in the same way. I mean, you and I have talked about this many times, but the kind of the lack of civilian military connection because we hive off our bases separately and because we don't have the same, I don't know, commitment. When I lived in the US, I was amazed. You always saw soldiers in uniform on the street. No soldier walked by anybody without getting a cup of coffee or someone asking to have their picture taken. And we're so much more subdued than that in terms of the relationship. And then you have this kind of almost feels like a one-off war. We fought it under the UN flag, right? That was also a difference.
it is the difference, and it's an important part of thinking about Canada facing outwards. If we think of the First World War, where we step out really onto the world stage, but as part of the British Empire, the
Yeah,
Statute of Westminster passed in 1931. We take control of our foreign policy. But then again, the Second World War, standing by Britain with Canadian national interests. And as I wrote about in my recent book, The Good Allies that you mentioned, where
yeah.
we have to lean into the United States to be able to fully support Britain in that war and to achieve our own national interests. But we are fundamentally changed by the Second War. We become an industrialized nation. We're a wealthy nation. The creation of the social security net, 1 million veterans in Canada, sense of Canadian identity advanced, that and so much more. But also understanding that we can no longer be an isolationist nation. We join NATO. We agree. We pick a side. We're never neutral in this, and we are with the British, but much more the Americans. And that's, in a sort of macro sense, that's where the Korean War sits in 1950 for Canada.
Okay, you know what? Let's just go back to basics. The book Canada and the Korean War: Histories and Legacies of a Cold War Conflict. And of course, that's important. What was the battle? What sparked it? Why did we go? Why did the UN knock on our door?
Yeah, well, it goes back, I suppose, to June of 1950, where North Korea, communist North Korea, invades the South. It had been divided very recently after the Second World War, like Germany had been
Yep,
divided. Sometimes we have to say that for some younger people, Senator, who may
exactly.
not
They don't
remember that
remember.
time. And so the world is still in ruins. The communist threat is on the rise. Some listeners may remember the Guzenko affair
Right,
in Ottawa, where a Soviet low-level clerk leaves his embassy and reveals this great spy ring, because, of course, we had allied with the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Now, at the beginning of the war, they were ostensibly neutral and with
right.
Hitler's Nazis. But when Germany invades in June of 41, the Soviets are on our side. But that breaks down very quickly. So it's
I,
a
I just got to say, when I came to Ottawa as a young reporter, the Gazinko affair was, I mean, this made politics and Ottawa so sexy and interesting in journalism because we'd never heard of such a thing. Anyway, it
yeah,
was a very intriguing story
yes, it was. Yeah. Walking around with a paper bag on his head,
on
you'll
his
remember.
head.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. To dissuade supposed Soviet assassins from getting him. Um, so
Amazing.
that's the context here. It's that early Cold War, and of course China, which had gone communist in 1949, or at least the communists had won that civil war, and the Soviet Union supporting North Korea in this invasion. So very much it's the first hot war of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that's the context there, where the North Korean forces crash over the border and drive the South Koreans back. The Americans driven into a corner of the peninsula, in the Pusan area, or Busan as it's called now, and really fighting for their lives. And so the Americans respond with a force there in Japan, and Canada is called upon. And initially, to be fair, we're not sure we really want to send troops. And so we send 3 destroyers, and they're seen as a token force. And eventually, we are forced to send a larger contingent. But so this is the history, or the context around this. The West survives that initial first months. The Americans counterattack and drive the North Koreans back, but then they get too close to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese pour across, and it becomes a much larger war, largely with China leading the fighting here, vast armies. And the West, again, the Americans in the lead, but British, Canada, Australia, and South Koreans fighting in large numbers, really relying on technology and tactics to hold off often these human wave attacks. And this continues through 50 and 51. There's a stalemated front, and then a search for peace that goes on for about a year and a half there, when the war finally ends in July of 1953, with not a lot having been achieved except for millions of South Koreans and North Koreans killed, and a sizable number, although far less, of Allied soldiers who die in this fight. And so perhaps maybe initially that ambivalent ending, without a clear-cut victory, like in May of 1945 or
Right.
August of 45, helps to or contributes to the fact that Canadians don't pay a lot of attention to this conflict, even while it's going on.
Yeah, because you even feel that, and I know I've talked to Korean vets about this, that if they are in a gathering and start to talk, and I think you've even written about this, that they'll be told, pipe down. It wasn't really a real war. We're telling our stories from World War II, and that's the real thing. I mean, that is profoundly sad.
Yeah, that was the initial reaction when many of these men came back. And Canadians didn't know a lot about what was happening. Now, we shouldn't say no one did, because Pierre Burton was there
Yeah.
reporting.
Yeah.
Rennie Levesque was there for a while. Many journalists were there. So Canadians were aware of this, but in a way that I think many Canadians were aware of the Afghanistan war. In some places, it's really prominent if you have a military base near you. Of course, if you have a loved one there or you know
Yeah.
someone. But many Canadians didn't know that. And so they were getting on with their lives. And in the early 1950s, we're a very prosperous nation. Of course, the baby boom is happening then. They
Right.
have great families and communities.
Suburb
So
is being
suburbs,
are
that's
being built.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the government of the day, Louis Saint-Laurent's Liberal government, was able to juggle a number of things. And the war was never the most pressing issue. The economy was, and other aspects. So it was very much a limited war. And when many of those veterans came back, you're right. For those who sought out other veterans, they were often told that they were in a police action, which was a really unfortunate term that the American president Truman used, partially to get around Congress. But it
Right.
stuck, right? This wasn't a war, it was a police act. That's nonsense. It's wrong. It was a war, and it took time, but eventually, and I think we have to be fair here, eventually, of course, the Royal Canadian Legion and other veterans groups recognized and embraced Korean War veterans, although they've always had their own separate association as well, even though members are often part of the Legion and the Korean War
I
Veterans
was
Association.
looking for some dates here, but I can't see where that they weren't. I mean, they didn't even have their own memorials or their own recognition for quite some time. Like I think well into the 90s, actually.
90s. Yeah, that's a really fascinating story. If we think of monuments and memorials and how our wars marked and remembered, and many of the structures of remembrance that we have, which we are doing now, we're both wearing poppies, of course, go
Right.
back to the Great War and that
Yeah.
terrible cataclysm of loss and defeat, and John McCrae's poem in Flanders Fields, and the poppy, and Armistice Day marked in 1919 and renamed Remembrance Day in 1931, the building of thousands of monuments across the country, Vimy and Beaumont Hamel overseas, the National Monument downtown. That's the period where we really engage in commemoration and remembrance. And we do something a little different for the Second World War. But the question will be, how will we mark the Korean War when those veterans come back, when the war ends? And we don't really do a good job. The Second War veterans, and one of my earlier books, I think we talked about this in COVID, Senator, The Fight for History.
Yes.
Those Second World War veterans, they wanted their own separate monument in downtown Ottawa. They said the National Monument, which is near Parliament, is a great monument, but it's too closely linked to the Great War, those 22 figures passing through the arch. And there was a fierce debate in Canada over if a Second World War monument would be created. Ultimately, it wasn't. Various governments said no. And it wasn't until 1982 where the dates for the Second World War and the Korean War were added to the National Monument. So, what happened in the 30 years for the Korean War vets is that they didn't have monuments, really. Sometimes the names of fallen soldiers were added to the existing monuments in communities, but that was different in every community.
Yeah.
And you've alluded to the separate monument unveiled in 1997 in a Brampton cemetery, which is a very strange place, frankly, to have it in a civilian cemetery. And I write about this in the book. The Korean War veterans wanted a separate monument. They were denied that several times by various governments, and eventually they built their own. And so it is seen as a national monument, but really we have a number of national monuments. The key one remains the one in Ottawa.
Right.
Many Korean War veterans came out in 1997, and the fact that they had to raise their own money, they received not a penny from the government of the day. They had to raise their money, that cemetery in Brampton gave that land to the veterans. They saw that again as a snub against their contributions, their service, and their sacrifice.
And Korea, South Korea itself has actually done more than Western nations. They're the ones that embrace. They will take Korean War vets and their families and bring them to Korea and really celebrate that in a way that we still don't.
No, you're exactly right. It was around the mid 1970s, the South Korean government, as it's becoming that country more prosperous, as it
Right.
realizes that so many of these young men at the time had fought for their survival, they began to bring back veterans, including Canadians, who go back on official tours, again, as you said, largely paid for by the South Korean government.
Yeah.
And they're surprised. I've spoken to many of those veterans because they had been forgotten in their own country. But here they are welcomed back as the liberators or the defenders that they were. And it's not dissimilar to what happens with Second World War veterans in the Netherlands in
Yeah, in the Dutch, I was
1905.
just going to say the city is ablaze with tulips
Yeah.
in the spring. The thank you is ongoing.
Yeah. And I argued in my previous book, The Fight for History, we did a poor job in telling our military history in this country in the 60s and 70s and
Yeah,
80s. There's reasons for that, anti-war movements, to distinguish ourselves from the United States. We often raised up the image of the peacekeeper. We
yeah.
downplayed that we had an armed force and other aspects. So we didn't create films and documentaries. We didn't encourage veterans to talk about their experiences. There's lots of reasons. But ultimately, I argue we neglected our Second World War history. But that changes with the 50th anniversary. And the return of those veterans in the Netherlands is critical, covered by all the news media,
Right.
outlets. And Canadians kind of woke up to this strange thing of the Dutch celebrating Canadian veterans when we had ignored them.
Yeah,
And a similar
exactly.
thing happens with the Korean War. And it takes sometimes another country to maybe alert Canadians to the blind spots that we have. And that's a case here with the Korean War.
And it's true on many other fronts. I mean, honestly, I don't want to diminish the power of what you're saying, but we don't think our comedians are funny until they go to the US and perform. We don't think our, singers and songwriters are important until the US embraces them. Like, I don't know why we can't just say, look what we did. I mean, we came home after, I say the royal we, but I mean, after World War II, we had a stellar international reputation. The Allies knew what we had done, but it was less discussed here.
Yeah, we have failed to tell our story too
Yeah.
often. And I sometimes that's apathy, sometimes it's the Canadian, oh shucks,
Yeah,
gee saying sorry when someone walks into us.
we're not like
Um,
those Americans that wave the flag and put their hand on the heart. And I
yeah,
wish sometimes we were. To
that,
have that patriotism and to be more public about it. One of the things you just touched on, and I wanted to come back to it for a moment, is the hostilities ceased in 1953. Is that the same as the war ending? Because it
well,
wasn't quite as clear.
no, it's not clear. You're right. The war officially has never ended because
Yeah,
an armistice or a cessation um, technically isn't an end to it. And I mean, just look at North Korea today,
yeah,
extremely aggressive, and it's on the back pages because of the wars in the Middle East,
yeah.
the war in Ukraine. There's over 100 wars being fought around the world today, civil wars,
Is that
conflicts.
really today?
Yeah, it's astonishing. And so
Wow.
most of them we don't pay attention to, but North Korea has been extremely aggressive in firing missiles and in bellicose language and aggression. And
On behalf of Russia, largely,
that's
but
right.
yeah,
Proxy wars and sending North Koreans to fight in the Ukraine front and others. But so that's a long way to say yes. For those who are maybe not as familiar with that area of the world, it remains a very dangerous place. And thank goodness the fighting ended in 1953, the direct,
Yeah,
big battalion fighting. But there has been programs of assassination and special operations and all of the other aspects of psychological warfare and
right.
asymmetrical warfare. So you're right that war technically didn't end. I think most Canadian veterans would have seen it as an end,
Yeah,
but is it again reminds us on how wars end can shape how we think of war. And if you'll
exactly.
permit me just very briefly, the Great War ends on November 11th, 1918, but it's such a terrible slaughter that no one's quite sure how to make sense of it. The Second World War is a decisive war, and we know how we talk about that. The Korean War has this ambivalent ending. Think of Afghanistan,
Yeah,
right? A war, or
same problem.
with which was problematic even before the fall of Afghanistan, but now is clearly a defeat. So how do we make
Yeah.
sense of these things and the sacrifice of those who take part in them? It's changing, it's malleable, it shifts with societal currents and understanding, with our creation of monuments and history books and documentaries. All of it comes together, and it's why someone like me, a historian, I'm interested both in what happens in war, but also those shifting currents of memory as well.
Yeah. And this reluctance, I mean, you hear certainly throughout the course of the US election campaign, all the discussion about foreign wars and we don't want to go down that road again. And in our own country, talking about the role of peacekeepers as opposed to soldiers and fighting men and women, and somehow we're in denial. And then you quite rightly explain there are 100 wars underway in the world as we know it. I mean, it's we do seem to be in a bit of denial about this.
Yeah, we live in a very dangerous world. I think we have a greater sense of that with the major wars,
Yeah,
especially Ukraine, I think, and the pressure it has put on the West to engage more thoughtfully and significantly in defense spending, and to decide how we will respond to requests for military aid and the inclusion in alliance systems and all of that. And I guess there's a lot to unpack there, but I would say that for Canada, we're always a part of various alliance systems, NATO
yeah,
primarily, but also NORAD with the United States, United Nations missions, although far less today than in the
yeah,
past, and other aspects. And I think, the fierce debates in the United States election, and some of which have been over alliances and the cost of them, and paying the full, and what the United States should pay and what others should pay. That's part of those discussions. But we are at our own peril if we forget the past. And one of the reasons why the United States has been so successful as a superpower, as a military power, is that it has always led alliances. But the
yeah,
key word there is led alliances. It's a part of various alliances. And as I argued in my book, The Good Allies, as I was writing that, Canada is often taken for granted in the United
yeah,
States because we've been such good partners, such good neighbors for the most part. But North America and the Northern Hemisphere cannot be defended if you are in Washington or the Pentagon without Canadian help. And we
no,
have
we're right
been
here.
there, and
We
we're
kind of
there.
stand between them and a lot of other people, and when they see us not doing our job, leaving the Arctic so vulnerable, not even stepping up with our 2% commitments to NATO operations, you can understand why people in this, as you describe, very and in some ways increasingly dangerous world, we need to step up. We need to, be at the ready.
Yeah, I
It's
think
odd.
Canadians have a greater sense of that, certainly over the last year. I think, and opinion polls bear this out,
Yeah,
that 2% spending is now, I think, acknowledged as something we need to do. How you get there is a different story.
yeah,
And again, if I can go back to my book, The Good Allies, or this Korean War book, The Good Allies, I think, revealed something to me that I didn't fully understand, was that during the Second World War, Canada needed the United States to fully support Britain, but the United
Right.
States needed Canada for to supercharge its wartime economy using our minerals and our hydroelectricity and our nickel and our sending
Exactly.
weapons
Yeah.
back across the border. It couldn't have defended the East Coast or the West Coast or even Alaska without Canadian support. And so that too is worth remembering. The 2%, and I'm a historian, Senator, I'm more comfortable looking backwards than
Yes,
forward.
then forward, I know.
But if there's a lesson from the Second War, is we should think very carefully about how we can assist our allies. And it may be sending a battle force to Latvia, but without a doubt, as you have mentioned, it is also in the Arctic. We need to stand up and put more resources into building up infrastructure, in
Yeah.
making sure we have the right naval vessels, and many other aspects that are both part of security but also sovereignty. And I think that's a
Yeah.
lesson for me from the
Absolutely.
Second World War.
The sovereignty part is so key. I mean, we run around and claim that it's ours and has always been ours and it's this and that. But if you don't have a presence, if you don't pay the bills in any way, then it's pretty hard to claim you're the owner.
Yep.
Possession is 9/10 of the law, and we're not there.
Yep.
And I think about the proximity of that region too, because it was just going through my brain as a reporter. I went to the DMZ, the dividing line between North and South, and and you see how close that is. you
Oh, yeah.
know, like we have these arbitrary lines, we have these arbitrary borders, and it's important, however crazy it seems, to protect them because once that slides, once borders start to meld and disappear, then it's kind of a free for all, and that's really dangerous.
Yes. I mean, if history and the history of war has taught us anything in the 20th century, even before, you don't want to be Belgium, Poland, or Ukraine, the bloodlands, the areas that get fought over.
Yeah,
War is horrendous, but it is far worse if your country is the battleground.
yeah,
And if I need even to one more example, during the Cold War, as you know, it was thought that first Soviet bombers would fly over the Arctic to attack probably US cities first, but probably Canadian cities as well. And then ICBMs in the late 1950s that are nuclear armed. Who's the battleground there? The Arctic is, the Canadian Arctic. And that would have been horrendous. Just think of shooting down one of those nuclear armed bombers or ICBMs. The entire North, or a good chunk of it, would be polluted to this day and probably for decades or hundreds of years beyond that.
yeah,
So, you know, don't allow yourself to become the battleground, which is,
yeah,
as you've said, have a strong border, have a military, have a presence. You can't always decide these things, and fate will intervene. But if you are weak, and if other nations, especially aggressive ones, helmed by dictators, believe that your sovereignty can be impinged upon, if we can't stand up for ourselves, if we can't stand with our allies, those are all things that worsen our ability to
yeah.
make the already difficult choices that happen in times of conflict, stress, and God forbid, war.
Well, even when you think about the Russia today, the United States today, I mean, even at the best case scenario is that we're literally in the middle and would be collateral damage. I mean, bombs and planes and guns don't always hit dead on their targets. We're right here. It's something that needs to be more real for us. And I wonder, on Remembrance Day, we do look back and we think about the veterans and those who served and the price they paid. But we sometimes forget that this is an ongoing situation. You have to fight this on a daily basis, not just say, "Oh, we won that." we won that cause, the communists are gone, or that country's at bay, or, this is an everyday issue.
Yeah, and I hear that from my interactions with members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah,
And I think we have a better sense today than we did a year ago, or where we maybe did 3 years before that, that this very dangerous world in which we live, and each of our chiefs of general staff and senior commanders have been saying this over and over again to parliamentarians and to the media and to others, that we really do need to understand that this is not an abstract notion, that war could very well come, and it would be devastating, but it will be far worse if we are unprepared and that our armed forces are not able to conduct and carry out the missions that we call upon them to do. And I think Canadians understand that, even if there are still hard choices that must
yeah,
be made. I think of former head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who came to Ottawa a few months ago. I was lucky to be at a talk he gave where he said, I know defense spending is difficult. As he said, I was a former prime minister too.
right.
It's tough when you have to spend money on education and health and infrastructure and all the other things. But if you don't spend it now, it costs a lot more later
Later.
on. I think there's a lesson there.
The other thing, and I don't really want to end on such a dire note, but in fact maybe we should, which is, we didn't see in the same way the brutality of World War I, because there weren't cameras and video in the same way that we saw, nor was there the technology to save them. But here we are, watching the brutality, the Russians sending in troops to slaughter, to be slaughtered and to slaughter, people not really mattering. What we saw on October 7th with the brutality of Hamas against the Israelis, like, this is almost in a day of modern technology where war can be clean. We seem to be reverting to more brutal tendencies. Am I just seeing that because of the visuals, or is it there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I haven't thought it through. I think we have to give credit to the war reporters and war
Yeah,
journalists who are putting themselves in harm's way everywhere, um, and who are bringing us these difficult stories, things that we have to see, because if you don't see them, they don't register. And
exactly.
even then, of course, we live in this age of information overlord, over a load, and sort of
Yeah,
this constant attention grabbing. And even then, we know it can be difficult. And it's just something like the American election, which just
yeah.
blankets everything. And
Yes,
it's
it
really
cut,
hard to,
cuts out everything else. Yeah,
yeah,
including what's going on in our own country.
yep, that's right.
You know,
So is warfare different? To some degree, technology changes, and so weapons change. And the
yeah,
war in Ukraine, I think, is really interesting insofar as it looks on the one hand like old style trench warfare, attritional battles, artillery heavy, infantry attacks, as we see from the First World War and the Second World War. But then you add in drone warfare and
yeah,
information warfare and satellite disruption and who knows what else. So it's a different aspect of warfare. But I guess in my 25 years of studying military history and wars, there is one truism I have thought of, and it is that war is always fought by people. It's
yeah,
fought by men and women. It the technology changes, the warfare has a different character to it than the last war, but it's always about boots on the ground or the
yeah,
equivalent there. It's about how ordinary men and women cope and endure, how they fight and try to survive, how they kill and how they are killed. And maybe that's something to think about, that there's no, except for very few circumstances, very few instances where warfare is clean and over quick. It is almost
yeah,
always ghastly, beastly, and filled with unbelievable brutality. And of course, as we know now, if we think about veterans, it doesn't end with an armistice or a victory.
No.
The scars of war, physical and mental, go on for years and decades. And we should remember that too, that when we have asked men and women in the Canadian context to stand up for us, to engage in conducting our national interests, the debt to them does not end with the final shot. We need to spend the years and the decades ensuring that they are right, that they have a place, that we listen to them. And that is part of the fulfillment of our debt to our veterans.
It's easy to send them off to war, even ill-equipped. It's much harder to take responsibility when they come home. And that's what we really need to focus on. And I think it's a good message for Remembrance Day. Tim, as always, just always fascinating to talk to you. And thank you for doing what you do. So I'm just going to say this latest one, Canada and the Korean War, Histories and Legacies of a Cold War Conflict, and not to forget Canada's role in that. And as I said at the beginning, we'll just repost the podcast we did recently with you on the Good Allies, because it's a very interesting take on World War II, and our role and what we played. But we need to not sweep that history and those stories under the rug. We need to tell them warts and all, and stand up for what we have done and those who took us from point A to point B at a great price. Tim Cook, great to be with you.
Thank you, Senator.
We'll talk again soon. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you again very soon.